So David Dorn, what is your motto to playing on records?
My motto is, the day I stop learning is the day I get out of music.
Wow, that's powerful. And a great way to start a conversation where we're going to share your journey and path to greatness in the session playing world, in the hope that we can help motivate, educate, and inspire the next generation of musicians that are coming up.
Absolutely.
So where did your musical journey start when you were a kid?
Well, it started in diapers. I don't remember this, but my dad told me when I was 3, I would hop up on our family piano and start like tinkering around and playing the tunes back from my cartoons. Like I could memorize it and start playing off the things like, I don't know that everybody can do that. So he was like, well, let's see what happens, and if he keeps showing interest on the piano, maybe we'll get him some lessons. So my dad wasn't really musical. He knew how to play a little bit on piano. And so he showed me a couple of the notes and like what they were. And pretty quickly he was like, all right, that's about the extent of my knowledge, so we need to get you a piano teacher. So I started taking formal lessons when I was 5 years old, and studied with a lady, and she really helped cultivate my love of music. She recognized pretty quickly that I played by ear, and she was like, all right, I'm gonna make you learn these notes because I know you're playing by ear and memorizing what I'm playing for you. And so I started learning how to read music, and I guess around I was 8 or 9, I started playing at church. I would sub in for our organist, and I'd play like the basic hymns, on Sunday. And I just kept going. Music was always part of my life. I sang with my brothers. They're both musicians as well. Although they don't do music professionally, they're great musicians in their own right. And so we sang gospel music, played a lot of church stuff. And after that, I changed teachers to a lady that had moved from Florida who was more of a true like classical musician. And she took me under her wings. I guess I was 13, and she helped me for the next 4 years. And one of my family friends said, hey, David's really showing like the type of interest in music and the ability to maybe try to get into the governor's school. And that was at Greenville, South Carolina. So I auditioned. They took 7 pianists from the entire state, and I was one of them. And so I studied with 2 touring pianists for my last 2 years of school. So I moved up there, and it was basically like pre-conservatory training. It was tough. Got my butt kicked. You realize quickly that you are not the big fish anymore when you get into that situation, and you had to work really hard. So learned how to practice.
Was like the end of high school?
That was the end of high school, yeah. So I did my junior and senior year, and I lived on campus there. It was basically you were a boarding school, for lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. And it was pretty much, we had a month off, and I would go back and see my family, but the rest of it I was studying, working.
Nice. Yeah. So taking it back to like when you're starting, 5 years old, starting to take piano lessons. Yep. I know piano teachers can sometimes get a bad rap for the strictness and stuff, and some kids have trouble kind of having the mentality or determination to kind of stay through it. Yep. So for you, learning music theory young as someone that could play by ear, did you have any challenges with that, or any like conflicts where you're like, hey, I know how to play this, I don't need these notes? And what did you learn from learning music theory?
Yeah, man. When you play by ear, you kind of, whether you realize it at that age, you have an advantage over, because your ear is really what ends up helping you. I mean, even for today, where I'm at, my ear is everything. But it was really, my teacher, she had a lot of grace for me, because she really forced me like to learn it. She's like, I know you know it. I know that you can do it, but I want you to internalize it and be able to read it, so that in case there comes a time where you can't listen to it, you can sit down and play it. And so I'm so grateful that she did. It helped me tremendously in church music. That I could open up a hymnal and read it and play a hymn no matter what, even if I hadn't heard it. So I do think that some teachers get a bad rap because she encouraged me to use my ear. She recognized it as a gift and a talent, and she wanted me to cultivate that. But she did want me to have the other side of it and learn theory, and she taught me all of that stuff. And particularly when I went to my second teacher, who was a more classical pianist, she really helped me learn when to use my ear and when not to. And I think that was important. And I give a lot of credit to them because they were the type of teachers that weren't so strict that they didn't allow me to learn other music. It wasn't like I had to only play these classical pieces. I would come in and say, hey, I learned a new tune. This is a song that I'm listening to that I like, and she'd be like, well, play it for me. And so she would sit there and indulge me while I played some pop song that had come on, and she's like, that's cool. All right, now we're gonna do this today. But she allowed me to have those moments, you know?
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So I think you said something really profound there about knowing when to follow the sheet and when not, and that's something that definitely applies to making records.
Yeah.
What are some examples of how that had an impact when you were younger and then how it's affecting you now?
Well, I would say that one thing that I thought was really important is that when you learn to read, you know, it allows you to take on a whole nother, I mean, there's thousands of compositions that have been written out, and you know, to be able to sit down and dissect that music by just reading it, even if for me, like sometimes it would take 8 bars, I would learn 8 bars, but I would read it and I'd learn each part in each hand. You know, there is something to be said for using your ear to do that, but to be able to just take what somebody's given you and say, okay, I can see what you've written, and now let's play it, and then you learn it from that. I don't know, you don't do it as much in the session scene, I guess, but there have been sessions where it's been really helpful that somebody's come in and said, I really want this part like I've got it. It's like, perfect, it's written out. I can play it exactly how you want it. You know, that's one of the advantages, I think, too, of keyboard players. We just inherently have most of the time learned to read music because piano is so built around written out music, you know, whereas maybe a guitar player didn't study classical guitar and they didn't learn that, but you know, they also had the advantage of their ear being so good that they can, you know, hear a chord voicing and like know exactly what that is, you know, whereas for me, it's like, I can hear that, but it's easier if somebody's written out that chord voicing. It's like, I know what that is. That's a C major 7, and that's easy, you know. So the advantages, I think, in the session scene is that it allows you to have some more gig opportunities because a lot of players can't read music, you know.
So it's a great tool.
It's a great tool. It's an
Does
asset.
it help at all in visualizing maybe like an idea, even if it's not going to be something that's written down?
Yeah,
just sort of...
it definitely can. I think that when you're actually looking at it, it can be super helpful to say, okay, these notes are moving up the scale, so I know that this is going to be a movement toward a higher part or coming down like a cascade falling part. It's like that can be tricky to learn by your ear. And if it's written out, it's just
you can see
exactly how it's going to be laid out. Yeah.
So after you went to this amazing school and became one of the 7 people in your state that got thrown in there, that's amazing, man. Then what happened after that? Did you move to Nashville and then?
Well, you know, I wanted to.
Thousands of people.
I know. I wanted to actually. I had come and looked at Belmont after I was in my senior year. I came up and I really loved, I thought Nashville was where I wanted to be. But I auditioned, I got in, I didn't get a sizable scholarship, and Belmont doesn't really give a ton of scholarships anyway. A school that I was also interested in South Carolina, they offered me a full scholarship to go for music, which was amazing. I was like, well, I feel like I got to take that route, and I had a great piano teacher there. And he is somebody I'd worked with before and very well known and respected throughout South Carolina, where I grew up. So I went to Erskine College, and I spent 2 years there. Interestingly enough, my first 2 years at Erskine, I had already done so much of the theory and music history stuff in my previous school that I ended up kind of becoming a tutor for some of the other students that were freshmen in college. So I kind of helped tutor them since I had already kind of gone through those courses. And I wasn't able to necessarily just get out of them, so they were like, well, here's what we'll do. If you'll be willing to help tutor some of the other students, we can help, get you through those courses faster. So that's what I did. So I spent 2 years there, and then my piano teacher decided that he was going to get a new job, and that new job happened to be Belmont. And so I was like, well, that's fate, because there's no point in me being at this school without him here. So after he got the position at Belmont, I said, well, I'm just going to go ahead and transfer up, because I was planning on moving to Nashville after I got done with college anyway. And I was like, this just makes more sense to go ahead and get here and get settled into the town I want to be in.
That's awesome. So it was really the piano teacher that was, I guess, your mentor at the time that you had such a great relationship with. How important do you think mentorship was in your process and is in everyone's process?
I think it's extremely important. I was so thankful to have somebody that helped me navigate certain things that I wouldn't have known. When I was playing classical music, there was always a sense of like, you can only do one thing, that's it. Like, if you're gonna be a classical musician, you be a classical musician, that's it, that's the path. This teacher, he knew that I had other interests, and he was very gracious to me to say, hey, I know that you wanna do other things. Let's concentrate on these things right now, but know that I support what you're doing. Because at the time, I was actually already playing some sessions in South Carolina on Christian music. And he was always like, if that's something you love, do it. And when we talked about moving up to Nashville and the Belmont thing, he's like, I think this is going to be a great opportunity for you, because I know you are interested in recording in studios and songwriting and all these things. It's like, and that's the place to be. And I was like, yep, that's where I actually wanted to go, at first even. And he's like, well, I think this is where we're supposed to be. And so it was really nice to have that mentor with me at Belmont for that first year, knowing that I had a familiar face, knowing that I still had the path of what I needed to do on my classical route, but I had support to go do other things.
That's amazing.
And it was great. I mean, that's not the norm in classical music.
Well, that's what I was going to say too, is that I think so often, like traditional education or even just music teachers in general, we look at it as someone that we're hiring or that is hired by the school to educate us, and we have to go through a class, and then you have to pass that class to move forward to the next thing. It's a very like transactional sort of relationship. But if someone knows that music is something that they want to do for their career, I think that it's really important to find someone that can really guide them and mentor them and be that level of support, which might be something that up and coming musicians should be thinking about.
Absolutely.
Is my music teacher my mentor or just an instructor that is getting me through this next class? And if they're not there, then maybe searching for one that that is, and really finding that level of support that you can learn from.
I think it's super important to have somebody that can help guide you through more than just the classes. I've said this before to a lot of younger musicians that have asked me for advice. I'm like, I think it's hard for me to tell a student to go to college for music, particularly if you're paying that tuition cost, because it's a lot of money that you're taking out if you're not getting a full scholarship. And you do have to do those transactional sort of agreements of like getting through your classes. That is part of it. Now, those can be beneficial, but I think it's almost more beneficial to just have someone that is a mentor to you and can help you navigate the ropes outside of the education system. And that's not to downplay it, because I think that I did learn a lot of things there and it was helpful. But I also think that if I need a teacher to tell me to practice, I'm already not in the right career path, And I've seen that in students, it's like they didn't practice on their own. They did it for the transaction of getting the grade, And it's so competitive, particularly when you move into a town like Nashville, where there's some of the best musicians in the world, if not the best musicians in the world. They don't need a teacher to make them practice. They're doing it because that's all they know to do, is to play music.
Absolutely. Man, that's great advice.
Yeah. So
a good thing to consider.
Yeah.
So once you got into Belmont and you're there, tell me about what that experience was like. And it
was a great experience. I tell people a lot of times that Belmont for me was where I really built relationships, and I used Belmont as a relationship building tool. That was probably the main reason I went there.
Yeah, that's probably the value that you get out of maybe getting
absolutely.
a music degree.
To me, that
want to be a
was the
professional
value
musician.
because I still work with people that I went to school with on a daily basis, and that's been, a long time ago, I'm not gonna say how many years. So, and that's awesome that I started a studio after I graduated with a guy that I met on campus that was an engineer. And we just happened to have a lot of the same philosophies on engineering. And we were like, well, why don't we get into business together? I mean, those are things that I would have never had opportunities to do without Belmont. So I credit that. And I also used the studio there a ton. Like, I saw that as an amazing resource to have a multi-million-dollar studio on the campus that, even though I wasn't in the engineering program, I made friends with engineers there so that I could utilize that space. And that led me to being able to have a studio after I got out of school. And those are the type of things that I think are important about school. That doesn't mean that you have to have school to find it, but when you have a group of people that are collectively there for music or audio or engineering or production, that's the same thing the music community is built around. It's a microcosm of that, but if you treat it relationship-based, it's a great way to build the tools that are necessary to be able to be successful when you get out of it too.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's a big point, is just finding your community.
That's exactly right.
So how did you start to find your community once you got out of school? What were the next stages for you?
Well, when I got out of school, part of that was when I started the studio, I utilized a lot of those friendships that I had at Belmont to kind of say, hey, I've got this studio going if anybody needs demos or anything done. Because I had friends that were still in school at that time. They would actually come over and track with me, and I would help build demos for them and do stuff like that. And there's always new people coming in, particularly in the school system. So I ended up making a lot of relationships through those Belmont connections that helped me find some other connections in town. And then I started playing with some musicians that weren't in that circle, but I met through the Belmont circle to get there. And those guys are still people that I play with today. And a lot of us were coming up just musicians hungry for any gig. I was writing a ton. Actually, when I got out of school, I thought that my career path was going to be mostly as a producer-songwriter. So I really leaned into writing with tons of people. Anybody that I could find to write with. I went to writers' rounds. I went to go hear music. Probably 3 or 4 times a week, I was out just listening. And if somebody I thought was great, I would go say, hey, I love what you're doing. I don't know if you'd be up for writing, but I'd love to write with you if you're ever up for it. And I got so many writes just by doing that. And a lot of those people ended up not being songwriters that continued on, but are still relationships that I have today that help in other assets in my life, man, I can't reiterate how much those relationships are everything. And I think when I got out, I realized quickly that it's like the way to work in this town is to know as many people as you can. And that paid off for me, honestly.
Now, I think that there's also something to be said for the idea of like networking for the sake of meeting new people.
Yeah.
And then the idea of what you keep talking about is building relationships. Where do you see the difference between that, and what did you do to actually build a relationship as opposed to just getting another number saved in your phone?
Right. Well, I remember this term, and I didn't know this term until I moved to Nashville, but there was a term of like Grammy that I was like, oh, I know what that is. That's not, I don't really have that. Like I don't really ever go up to somebody and say, what can you do for me? Or how can I get with you because you're gonna help pull me along? I think that can be, networking is important. And I think the way you go about it is, if somebody comes to me, it's like, I would rather you say, hey, I'd love to hear your story. I'd love to take you out to coffee and just talk and hear what you did. I'm gonna give that person a coffee meeting every time. And then if somebody's like, hey man, I would love to play on some sessions for you. Can you get me in on something? I would love to do that. There's a very small chance that I'm gonna do that. but I'll take you out to coffee and talk to you and get to know you every day. And then I might say, hey, this person's got something unique. Let me give them a shot because now I know what their background is.
Right.
And I think that's the difference. It's like go in very much just wanting to know that person, get to know them. And it might be a thing where it's like, that was really good. I don't know that our, career paths or objectives align. That's okay. But now I know another person. And if you put that, you never know where that relationship might come back down the road. So
Absolutely.
I treated that I was very careful about how I went about building relationships with people. And just my own personality in general is I really love to meet people. Like I always have liked getting to know somebody and know their story and what they're about,
Yeah, that's awesome.
So, yeah.
Do you think there's something to be said also for looking at that group of relationships that you're building and then finding ways to support other people through using those connections? I think something that often gets looked past is that we think about that one-to-one transactional relationship thing, as opposed to thinking about, okay, I just met this person. Now let's think creatively about how I can think about the person that I met 3 weeks ago that could really help this person. Maybe I can't help them, but I can help them indirectly through that.
Man, I think that, and there again, now you're talking about being a mentor to somebody potentially. You know what I mean? Like that, I think that's so important to get in and say, hey, I just met this person. This guy right here seems like a great musician. I know you're looking for a guitar player. Can I connect you two guys? That connection wouldn't have even been a possibility if that person hadn't reached out to me or I had known this person from a different circle. And I think that's so important. And I think the more people you go out and meet, the more opportunities you give yourself to have gig opportunities. I got so many gigs based off of that. When I got out of school. And honestly, I wasn't even looking to play gigs as much at that time. Like, I was concentrating on a different career path, to be honest with you. But I had played on a lot of gigs, and that is how I ended up getting into a band. Because I didn't know any of the other guys except for one guy. But that one person was in the band, and he's like, I know the keyboard player for us. I worked with him, like, a few times, and I love his playing. I think he's going to be the right fit, and that happened. And we got into a band, and I ended up signing a record deal with this band. That's awesome. It was just, and that's how that happened. One person,
right?
And now those are lifelong friends in that band that I make music with on a daily basis. So
that's amazing.
Relationships are everything, and how you use them. You know, and I think that's what your mention is like.
Exactly.
Be smart about how you use relationships. Don't just meet somebody and say, okay, like actually putting that Rolodex in your head. Okay, that person, I need to remember what they're doing, or put it in the phone. I actually put on the contacts what that person does, so that I'll help remember. If I go through and like, I'm looking for a guitar player or a drummer, I'll see all the drummer names. It's like, oh, that's the guy. That's who it was. Let me send his contact info over here.
Yeah. Now, something that I know that's really helpful for me as a producer when I have players that I trust and I trust their instincts is being able to go to them and ask them advice about other players.
Yeah.
And so through you building that deep, relationships with, with other people, you can eventually be able to develop a better relationship with someone that may be hiring you, even if they need somebody else, for a gig. But then they know that I can go to this person and trust them for that.
Yeah.
And that's probably how you start getting hired as a leader on sessions too, right?
That's exactly
Which
right.
Another really important part of having that deep role of relationships is being able to take on those bigger gigs.
That's exactly right. Absolutely. And I think kind of going to that, it's also why you have to be super careful about, the people that you do recommend, because it is a reflection of you as a player. If I recommend somebody, they're going to give that person a chance. And if they don't come in and nail it, then it's like, well, man, why did you send that person over to me when, I could have gotten this guy or, a multitude of other people, So you have to be protective of that a bit. And also, if you're a young player, it's like when you get that opportunity and a player that's maybe, further along in the career takes you on the wing, man, don't take that for granted. And don't think that that's just a cut-in line pass, because it's not. You still have to show up and do your gig and do it right, And if you don't, and it will come back to me, and I'll know, and So I think that's really important from both sides of it. And talking about being the leader on a session, like when you do get to that part of, your career path where people are actually like really needing you to kind of help take on the role as like a helper in the session, making sure that you're getting the right people called for that producer, because they might not know. That's a lot of trust that you've got now between that producer and your role. So you have to really just be careful with that. It's a lot of power that you have to know how to handle correctly. I mean,
absolutely. There's a quote that I love a lot that someone said, some smart person said a long time ago, that the person you're going to be in 5 years is a combination of the people you surround yourself with and the books that you read.
Oh yeah.
And I think that idea of the trust and if you're going to recommend people and building those relationships is thinking about surrounding yourself with people that are at the same level and above where you're at, have the same type of mentality and motivation. Not necessarily just trying to make a lot of friends and know a lot of people, but to know the right people that are going to be of the right mindset to put you in an environment that's going to move your career forward.
Absolutely.
And it sounds like that, that's what you're saying.
So
how important is that, and how challenging is it also? Because someone that you meet might be really cool to hang out with, but probably isn't the right person to be focusing on if you need to refer someone to something or bring them in on something, and that can be a challenge. So how do you navigate those relationships in a community that's so traditional business oriented?
I know.
I mean, a lot of it, we work together, but we're all friends and and buddies, and so that can be kind of a challenging thing to navigate.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the hardest parts of being. Those are the things that people don't tell you that you have to do as a session player. You think, oh man, my job is to sit in and just play music and do it really well. But it's really so much more than that. And I would argue that the people you surround yourself with is probably the most important thing about setting your career path the way that it's supposed to go. I love that you said that you needed to have people that were either at the same level or hopefully even above you, so that you're watching and learning. It's, going back to this whole you never stop learning idea, that is what that's about. Like, you need to find people that are going to push you. If you're surrounded by, a friend that all they want to do is just go party and go see music, which is fine, know that that's what that is, but that's not going to help you in your career path. Like, it could, but it's not likely.
Definitely not long term.
Not long term, exactly. And you really want to surround yourself with people that are hustling as hard as you are, because I've never looked at those people as competition. I've always seen those as my sort of just counterparts in what we're doing. That's the community. We're all together trying to get work and do what we're supposed to do and do it at the highest level. And when you're around those people, you can't help but do it at the highest level, because they'll recognize if you're not. And I've gotten called out, It's like, hey man, you need to either take a break because you're not focused as much as you need to, or it's like, hey, you look like you need this. It's like we recognize in each other what those things are, and that's who you want. That's that mentorship that you need to say, hey, you need to focus on this because you're not quite nailing what that is right now, So, man, I can't stress that enough. And I think it's really important to realize what group of people are those. And you can see it. I think a lot of musicians that are like-minded when it comes to work ethic are the ones that end up kind of raising up and making their way through the ranks of it, Because it's work. It's hard work. Yeah. It's like you can't. Sometimes you get lucky, but most luck is built by work ethic.
Yep. Harder you work, luckier you get.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Yeah, man. So you're at this point where you got out of college. Mm-hmm. You started a little studio. You're working on some demos. You're doing some songwriting. You had this kind of record deal thing that happened. So things are starting to happen. What was the transition that kind of got you more focused on playing in the studio, and how did that path look like?
Man, yeah, I feel like I had a strange path, to be honest with you. When I got out of school, I didn't even really know what a session player was, to be completely honest with you. I worked with, there again, a girl that I went to school with, a great singer, And she was working at a studio in town. And she's like, I really want you to come play piano because you've always played piano on my demos, and I want to do this thing. And so I went over to this studio called the Bayou, which unfortunately is no longer around, but it was a great, cool room, great spot. They were still on tape machine, you know. And I did my first session there. Like, I was greener than green, but the session guys were super nice to me. And, you know, I didn't really I shouldn't have been there, but she brought me in. But I played well. Like, I did what I was supposed to do, and everybody was like, hey, you did an awesome job. Like, I was the new guy, you know, and I was like, oh, so this, like, I talked to some of them after, and I was like, so do you guys, like, are y'all a band? Like, what do y'all do? You know, like, yeah, I was like, I didn't know. And they're like, no, we're musicians for hire, so we kind of work in different studios every day. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. You know, like, I didn't know that was a thing. I was like, well, wow, okay, that's pretty neat. I was like, well, that seems like a pretty cool job, you know? It's like, I've always either been in a band or just kind of worked with other musicians, you know? And I just would bring my friends in to play on something, you know, if I need a guitar. It's like, hey, could you come over and do this for me? You know, like, I didn't even notice that, like, that was a career path.
Now, there's a really good point that I want to make sure that we don't get past, because people need to understand this in that idea of the path, right? Your first session that you got on with other session players that were established session players did not come from a producer or from a studio or from another session player. It came from an artist that you were writing with, that you did demos with, and you built a relationship with, to the point where they trusted you to bring you in on their session, and that's where that opportunity came from.
Absolutely.
I think so often that people that are trying to break into this, they call a recording studio, they call producers, they contact other session players, they ask for opportunities. And what a great, incredible example is just so powerful is where your first opportunity came from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I didn't recognize, this is the interesting thing, I didn't recognize that at the time, because I was just focused on, you know, other things in my life, but I didn't realize, like, how important that was. But it started something in my path, because people were like, well, hey, can I get you to come play keys on my demo session? Because they either had liked the things that I played on something that we had written or whatever, and they're like, man, I'd love to have you come. And these were writer friends at this point, you know. And they're like, well, man, I'm doing a session. I remember, like, one particular instance, one of the bigger sessions that I did first thing was at Sony, ATV. And it was for a writer buddy of mine that we had written a ton of songs together, and he had heard about a musician that was doing demos named Ilya. And I had never met any of these guys. I walked in there. I'm sure they were like, oh boy, we got, you know, new guy here, newbie on the session, you know. But the writer requested that I be there to play on it. And ended up playing, and I guess, you know, I didn't play the same sort of things that a lot of other guys did, and so all the musicians around were like, wow, that was cool. Like, you're the only person I've ever heard pull sounds like that to do, you know, like, this is just what I do, you know. So that session ended up that I gave my number to a couple of guys, really being one of them. And I had another friend from Belmont that my wife knew, and he had started a studio, and Ilya was doing a lot of his demos there. And he's like, man, you got to get Dorn on some of your sessions, Ilya. Like, he's like, yeah, I worked with him the other day. Like, that connection happened. Like, I had worked with him a month and a half ago, and he just remembered. He's like, yeah, I worked with him. Yeah, we should do that. So I was on the bottom of the list. If none of his other keyboard players could call, I got the call. And it just so happened that I got a few calls in that time, and I came in, and, you know, I did what I did. I didn't try to be anybody other than myself on that session, for better, for worse. For me, it was better, and I was lucky in that sense, I guess, that, like, what I was doing just inherently as a player was what people were liking at that point. And so a lot of those writers that were coming through the Ilya camp, because a lot of times it would be a whole day, and we might have 13 different writers. It might be multiple writers all day long, It ended up getting me in front of a lot of people that I didn't know, and these were a lot of them signed writers with publishing deals, and they were doing a ton of demos back then. This was probably 13 years ago, 12, 13 years ago, and it was, rocking on the demo world at that time. And so I just kind of started making my way up through the ranks. I got called maybe what might be once or twice a month became once or twice a week. And that was when there was a shift that happened for me. It's like, okay, so I'm working these session things now. I'm still in a band. We were making a record. Chuck Ainley was doing it with us.
Awesome.
And Chuck's awesome, and he was really complimentary, and because we all played on the record as a band, and a couple of those guys were already session musicians themselves, But it started to say, hey, maybe you should think about this. Like, maybe this is a career path for you. Doesn't mean that you can't do production. Doesn't mean you can't write. But see where this goes. And so I just kind of followed it. And I guess in a lot of it, maybe it's a God way. It's like it just, that path opened up. And it became inherently clear that that's what I needed to do,
That's incredible.
To get to that next level for me. And
I think there's a couple things to unpack there that are pretty important. One of them is that for people that haven't been in that experience, the idea of the demo session situation.
Yeah.
So there's a group of writers. They may all come from one publisher. They may all be independent writers, and they're gonna book the studio that a band leader, in that case Ilya, is putting together. They're cutting it with Chris Utley at his studio. So he's got the studio, and the band leader's bringing it in, and then the band leader typically has the relationship with the writers or the publisher, and they're booking the band, and they each have slots to get their song recorded. So in that day, you guys have 3 sessions. Each one of those sessions is 3 hours, and in each one of those 3-hour blocks, you're cutting 5 to 6 songs, right? So that's where you get up to the 15 songs, 15 writers a day coming in and out. Everybody's got kind of a different thing that they might be looking for. And so in that situation, I think that's probably a lot of where you cut your teeth on figuring out how to work efficiently, how to read the room, and and that sort of thing. And you mentioned that in that scenario that you kind of got lucky in that, like, your instincts just sort of fit.
Yeah.
But was there any intention in that? And do you think that could be a positive or negative thing? Did you get lucky, or what's the lesson that we should pull from that?
I think that we should. Lucky is always such a term that I'm hesitant to use because I will say this: I am a study of popular music. Like, I listen to a ton of music. And so a lot of music I was listening to was pop music. And so I was drawing from that world and playing sounds from that world that I thought were interesting sounds and kind of bringing them into a country context where, for many years, country music was just piano, B3, whirly. That was the trifecta, It's like you played those 3 instruments, and whatever you did, you played from that. You might play a pad every now and then. You might play like a 1 synth sound or something every now and then.
Right.
But
what were you bringing to the
I was bringing in a laptop rig with with sounds on my laptop that I would use if I were producing. I brought those sounds with me and was playing. I was playing parts that I would have played as a producer myself. And I do think that there's something to be said for that instinct of knowing, like, hooks and being able to recognize, like, what sounds are going to be helpful to the session. Like, listening to what guitar players do, and it's like, well, I need to not be in that territory, or I need to find another way to enhance that. And those are things that I did because of coming from production world. And learning to really, like, understand the sonic spectrum of music. So going back to whether it was luck or not, I don't know if I could say. I just there was a change and a shift happening in the country scene where we were trying to bring some more pop element into it. And writers were even bringing in songs that were written with a more pop focus, I suppose, than the story song as much, And I did know how to play piano, and I tell this to a lot of young musicians: you still have to know how to play country piano. You have to know how to play B3. That's the correct style of what needs to happen in a country song. But I do think that for me, I just happened to hit a slot in time where having more of a sonic range and knowing a lot of sounds helped me along the way, you know.
And so you did that through just naturally being a fan of music, listening to a lot of it.
Listening to a lot of music.
But when did you start to really dissect that? Because that's an important thing to consider, is when you're listening to music, not just for like enjoyment, but really starting to think about how are these parts working together.
Yeah, and I've done that for such a long time. Like I started that when I was even in high school. One of the things that I love doing is I remember getting my first Tascam Portastudio. I would try to recreate songs, popular songs, find sounds. I always was into sound design, and I remember the first time I got a synthesizer, I just spent hours just learning everything, what this did, you know, and then I started recording those things. And so I would dissect listening. It's like, what's the drum pattern doing? What's that? Oh, what's the kick drum doing here? You know, what is that? Like, what's the sounds? Like, okay, that's the kick drum. Cool. I wasn't a drummer, but I learned what that was. And the unique thing about having synthesizers is there's a drum kit inside a lot of those things. So then you learn kick drum, snare drum, hi-hat, toms, all these things. And so I would start learning the patterns and building those and putting them into my little Tascam, and I'd build a drum loop. And then I'd say, okay, let me see if I can figure out how to play this keyboard sound that's in there. Oh, I really like that sound. How close can I get to it? I don't know how to play guitar, but I want to make a sound that's close to this guitar part that works, you know, like all of those things. So I was really starting to listen in to the sonics of what was happening on records. And I think that also came from an engineering background. Like I always was interested in engineering. I remember when I was at the governor's school, this is, you know, aging me, I would get on Google was still like a pretty, you know, newer thing. But I would go on to recording. They were starting to become these like recording sites. Home recording was a really big thing. And I would print all of these pages of info from home recording and study them. And so I could learn what recording was about. And this was stuff that I thought was more important for me if I wanted to become a producer. But I didn't realize in reality, it was helping shape me as a player. Just as much as it was as an engineer or a producer or any other part of it, because they're so tied together in the studio.
Right.
You know, I mean,
I think that's great, and because I think that's something that comes up a lot is that and when we talk about like kind of how do you figure out your path as a musician, a lot of musicians that I talk to say, you know, I feel like it's just instinct, you know, and that's true. But I also think that there's a path to that instinct. There's definitely like steps that happen. I mean, there's definitely like, I mean, you were born with a very specific talent.
Yeah.
But if someone also has, you know, that foundational talent, there's still these steps that we can sort of uncover and show people where that path is if they haven't discovered it.
That's the most important process of it. And, you know, unpacking that down to those small sort of like moments in time is tricky because a lot of it does happen without you recognizing it in the moment. But then when you step back and actually look through the lens of the past, you know, it's like you start to see those moments that really inform how you get to the next things, you know. And
so what happened in that demo session, or in that series of demo sessions when you started doing that, was that you had done your work as in theory, and you were able to play the main instruments, but you also came in with this thing that was a little different, that was fresh, but not so far outside of the box. It was it was relative to what people were looking for. Yeah. And that's something that maybe you didn't recognize in the moment, but we can look back at your experience, and we can, and someone that's getting started now can say, okay, I see how that happened. Now, how can I create that type of opportunity for myself?
Absolutely.
And I think that's what the people listening to this should be thinking about.
Absolutely, because that's what gets you to the next level, in my opinion. You know, there are thousands of musicians out there, but what makes your skill set unique? Because I do think that having a voice as a player, having all these tools, but yet still having something that's crafted, that's, somebody says, that's a David Dorn part. You know, it's like, that is, because I can recognize that it's something that I would play that maybe somebody else wouldn't play, you know? And how do you find that? And I think that's where the path is different for everybody. But it's the fun part of exploring and getting there, you know? And the end of the day, our job, and I think about this as far as like talking about the sounds being right, you know, it has to enhance that song. It has to be able to make that lyric and that melody better, or get out of the way of it. because it might not need anything.
Yeah.
And sometimes
Sometimes
recognizing not to play is just as important as playing something that needs to be there.
Yeah.
Our job is to make those songs lift up and sound like, wow, that took it from this, which might have been already a great song, to that sounds like it should be on the radio yesterday, and that's what you hope that you're doing it.
Yeah.
And demo sessions were the way that you did that, because writers were particularly looking for anything that was unique enough to get it paid attention to by an A&R person or an artist.
So nowadays, those demo sessions are still happening, but
Yeah.
not as frequently as they were before. So where do we find that parallel to what a musician that's in where your position was a few years ago to where we're at today?
Yeah. Well, I think that we're seeing a lot of people that are writing and tracking it together. Like there's the term track guy is used a lot around here, but I actually see it as more than that. It's like you're also a co-creator with that person in a lot of ways, and so I actually think that that's a great way to really cut your teeth today. It's like find a writer that you really like their music and say, hey, let me play some stuff for you, and just like let me help try to build up a demo for you. You might fall on your face, but you will learn something from those moments of failure that make you better. And hopefully that person recognized and said, hey, let's keep doing this. We can make these better. That to me that's a pathway now to getting into the session scene, is being able to be, I think we're all little mini producers sometimes on our floor, and we take care of our own parts. And I think the more you know about that stuff, the better of an asset you are as a session musician. Because the producer does rely on you. They rely on you to have command of your instrument, to know the sounds even when they might not be able to specifically say it. I tell people all the time, being a session musician is probably 10% playing, but also much more of being an investigator and a psychologist, and and being somebody that can socially know how to handle themselves. It's like those are the assets that people really need. Prereq is being a good player and putting the 10,000 hours in when nobody's paying attention.
Right.
And those are lonesome hours that allow you to be great when you get to the moment of having to be great.
Absolutely.
So
let's look at demo session world to getting into to starting to get on some records.
When I was working with Ilya on that stuff, there was this sort of like young group of guys coming up together. And I specifically remember thinking, wow, this is like a young generation of musicians kind of coming up together. Ilya was a little bit older than we were and had had some success. He was in a band that was signed to a deal for a while, and then he kind of made the transition, and he was like, I want to be a session player, because that's where he was really making his stride, in his career. And so one of the things that came from that was I met a lot of other musicians through those camps. There was always a revolving sort of cast of players, and that was what kind of helped, talking about going back to the player relationship with somebody. A lot of times I got recommended for something that led me to a new camp that I had never worked with before. And, sometimes you nail it, and sometimes it wasn't the right thing, and that's okay. It's like, but those are the things that help lead you to the next part of it. So you're playing these demos. Well, said writer might become a producer on the next record, which happened a lot, particularly in the time frame that we kind of went into a world of where writers ended up becoming producers in a lot of ways. And they had their favorite musicians that they wanted to bring up into their sessions because there was a comfort level there, So I think that I can speak from myself, like finding that group of guys that we all kind of clicked together as musicians. We all kind of helped each other come up the ladder. When somebody would get a gig that was a new account, they would say, hey, you should get my buddy to do this. And I would do the same for them whenever we had an opportunity. And so we were all working demo sessions all the time, but inevitably producers started coming in on these demo sessions that were major producers, particularly on the Iliad sessions, where they were also like saying, oh, I really like this band, or I like these guys. And that kind of helped bring me into some record things that I probably wouldn't have gotten into, honestly, because I will say that the master recording sessions, which we can talk more about that, but like when it's a session that a record label is paying for with a producer that's got a major label act, it's harder for them to take risk when it costs as much money as that budget is on a player that might not nail it. So going in, you have to, you just have to know that like you're gonna be under the microscope, and you're the new guy, and all those other guys have already done their time. So, you try not to get nervous. You try to stay in your lane and do what you do, and just know that you put all out on the floor. And that's what I did. Like I stayed with what I did. Like I just said, this is who I am. This is how I play. I'm going to continue to do that and hope that it works. And for me, it did. And we never stopped that. I'm always evolving. Like that's part of the gig is you evolve as you go. But I think if I were giving advice to somebody, the more people that you're around in that demo scene, even though it's less than it was, even now, I think that you still are making connections with future producers, future artists that get signed. And that comfort level you built with them is going to allow you to get into those sessions because they feel like that's somebody I can trust. They've always known it from me. I want them on my session.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's as much as the industry has changed, the thing that hasn't changed is the creation of music.
Absolutely.
And the fact that Nashville is the center, of that, and New York, LA, wherever someone is from, if you're doing that, and if you're not in a music-centric area like that, then there's all types of online platforms and ways to be able to connect with people. Yeah. So the idea is that around the world, there's thousands and thousands of songs that are being written every single day.
Yep.
And there's thousands and thousands of demos that are being recorded every single day. And there's also thousands of musicians that want to be a part of that.
Yeah.
But there's a huge pie, a ton of opportunity.
Tons of opportunity.
But that ton of opportunity is in that larger circle, in that starting point sort of thing.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, that opportunity in the end game, side of things, in the final stage where you're playing on hit records, that's a very small thing. Yeah. But as you've shown, the way that you get into that is by starting in this bigger pool and then slowly getting into smaller and smaller groups as you find your tribe. Yeah. You build those relationships that you connect well with and you stay authentic to yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and I love that, authentic to yourself, because I think that is something that's really important. That doesn't mean that you don't evolve and get better, because you never stop that. But you have a unique identity and like utilize that. Utilize your own instincts, Like they're not always gonna be what everybody wants, and that's okay. It's better for you to stay in that lane and hone in on those things and do what you do best, because people will recognize that. Like I think when you try to be the jack of all trades, sometimes that's not always in your best interest, Because there's always gonna be somebody that can play something maybe better, so, just reality of it, And I know some that can for me in my world, that I'd say, hey, that person's better at that thing. I would rather you call them. I've actually told people, it's like, you should call this person. I know that's crazy that I'm not taking on that work, but I would rather you get the right person for the gig. And when it's the right thing, you would call me for that because you know that I'm gonna nail that, because that's what I do. Mm-hmm. I think that's better.
Yeah.
And
that's a tough thing to do when you're coming up.
It's hard.
You're just trying to pay your rent.
It was hard for me. And I really struggled with that. I realized though that when I did stick to my guns on that, it moved my career further along.
It's a great lesson.
Yeah, it really did. And I think that's important. Yeah. And going back to what you were saying about there's always thousands of songs written, there are. And I would say that it's almost more important in today's world that they sound like records when they're turned in. I think the demo scene is still thriving because really there's very few demos that are turned in that are just a piano vocal or a guitar vocal these days. They want it to sound like a record when they hear it. So there's no, there's nobody saying that doesn't sound like a hit, because some people can't hear through it. And so that's a great opportunity for you to say, I'm gonna learn how to make a demo that sounds like a record. Because then when you can do that, you're an asset on that session, whatever chair you're in,
Absolutely.
So I think that's important.
Now, once you're in that situation, and really in sessions in general, there is a little bit of a balance between finding your identity and sticking to that, and then also being able to read the room and understanding how much of your identity you need to drop into each
That's
thing.
right, absolutely.
So where do you find that balance?
For me, I always defer to the song. The song is the leader of what you should play there. And I know it's sort of a big generalized statement, but truly, the song will lead you to what is the right sound and the right part. And if you're listening to the melody and the phrasing and you understand what the lyric is, listen to the lyric, pay attention to it. It'll inform you greatly about what the sentiment of the song is. And listen to the producer. Get there. A lot of times there's a reference, or the writer or the artist is given a reference of like, investigate. That's where I feel like investigate and say, okay, they're wanting this. Well, cool. I know how to do that, and let me play what I think should be there. But also always have 5 ideas in the back of your head ready to go when they're like, I don't think that's right. Okay, let me go to this and see if this is feeling better, And those are those things that you start that really come from just putting a lot of hours in the shop when nobody's paying attention. So that you've got
having all those tools prepared.
Having those tools prepared, that's exactly right. And knowing when to pull them out of the toolbox, because sometimes that's the wrong tool for that song. Even though it might be a great sound, or it's like, oh, I've got this cool sound that I worked on. Well, does it make the song better? And if it doesn't, then it's just a cool sound that's going to get muted. It's like, it's got to help, make the song. And I always say that the song and the melody dictate my parts. And I'm always listening to that. That's what informs me what to play.
That's great advice. Yeah. Now, how do you deal with ego or pride versus what the maybe producer or the person or the artist wants? And maybe it's not even the ego, but your understanding of what you really feel like is right. And maybe the artist feels like that is the absolutely wrong thing to do. It's a very challenging
It's a challenging circumstance, and sometimes I will say this, at the end of the day, it is a service industry, our position. Now, we're serving something that's, I think, an extremely high level. But you go to a restaurant, it could be the 3-star Michelin restaurant, and it's not what you want. You're not going to like it, and you won't go back. So I look at it as like, you know what? That's my taste. I mean, my taste might be this. But if that's what they're asking for, my job is to give them that as best as I can and do it at a high level. Play it as well as I possibly can. If it's 8 notes, I'm going to play the most funky, just tight 8 notes that it can be. It might be the most boring quarter note part, but if that's what makes that song better and that's what they're asking for, I'm going to play it as well as I possibly can. And a lot of times I'm shocked because I'll think something's not the right thing, and I go in and listen, I'm like, that really works. Like, I wouldn't have thought that worked as well as it did. So I think that always being malleable with your own instinct is okay. Like, like the taste aspect of it is what's hard about music, right? I mean, there are opinions everywhere, and they don't always align. But I do think the more you know about music, the more that Rolodex is deep when it comes to sounds and just knowing a lot of music in general. It allows you to hear what they're saying and say, hey, you know what? I know what you're asking for. I think I know how to do it. And then you can even bring your own spin on it. And a lot of times it ends up being a great part that wouldn't have gotten there if it was just you doing what you thought was right and them asking exactly what they wanted. That is that marriage of the 2 parts there, and that's what is really important about the trust. I tell people a lot of times, it's like that artist is coming in, and when they come into the studio, us as musicians can be intimidating a lot of times. Whether we mean to or not, we have played on a lot of music, more music than they probably ever played or written, know. But I think it's so important to know that they have value and they're coming to us to share our experiences with them to make their music better. And I really do believe this, that artists remember how they feel and producers remember how they feel when they're around you. And if you can make them comfortable and feel like you really worked hard to get their, get their music the way they wanted it, that will get you called back. every time, because that's who you want to surround yourself with. So I've learned to sometimes let my own taste play the back seat and be okay with saying, hey, I'm going to give you that and I'm going to make it sound the best that I can possibly make it sound.
So it sounds like there's definitely a balance with that.
Absolutely a balance.
And then I'm sure that in order to maintain your authenticity, there's probably a decision you make about certain people that you would continue to work with in the future.
And it's okay
but
to,
in the moment, you're going to deliver what they need and make sure that you leave happy, because whether you work with that person again, they still know your name, and the reputation can be everything.
And it's everything. I would argue that the reputation is everything.
Right.
In the music business particularly, everybody knows everybody. For better or for worse. It's and people talk about those things, it's just the way that it is. And I would rather somebody say I didn't nail it, but I tried really hard to give them what they wanted, than me sitting there saying that I just was unmovable rock that wouldn't try anything for them, because I don't want to work for that person. It's like, I don't want that to be on the floor for me either, Right. So, yeah, I do think there's a balance, and hopefully you're working with somebody that's got you there on the floor because they like what your instinct is and your taste is, and they want that. Those are great days when that's how it lies. But it doesn't always, and you got to be prepared to be able to navigate that. So
absolutely. Yeah. So I think now, as we're talking through your journey, we're getting a little bit closer to present time, I guess, where your primary sort of thing is playing on masters, working your studio that stays very busy, and so as you started to navigate that thing from being the new kid into being like the person that's getting nominated for the ACM Awards, what are some of the milestones, I guess, that happened along the way that you maybe learned from, and the experiences that you have that have helped you continue to learn as you move forward?
Man, and it's a never ending. I'm always learning. I never stop learning on that stuff. As far as milestones go, I think if you look at the career path, the first milestone was actually just being able to get into the demo world. That was a milestone. That set my career path, even though I didn't know it, you know? So I would consider that probably milestone number one. And then beyond that, I would say another one was when playing on your first, number one, that a song that you played on goes to number one. I think that's a big deal. Mine was Humble and Kind for Tim McGraw, which happened to be one of my favorite songs that I still have ever played on. And Lori McKenna, who wrote that, is somebody that I've had a relationship with since that moment, because I played on stuff for her and went out and played shows with her when she was touring. And those are those type of relationships there that opened up a whole nother world for me as far as writers and knowing people. And so I would say that was a big moment. And then I don't know how many number ones I've played on at this point anymore, which is kind of bad, I guess. But it's been quite a few at this point. And, of all those things that I'm proud of, I think the thing that I'm most proud of is that when people talk about me, they say that, hey, that dude works really hard to come in and always has a smile on his face. It always brings a good spirit to the session. And I can trust him to come in and take care of his chair and do what needs to be done. Those are the things that make me the most proud. And that's a milestone. To be able to hear that from the people that you work with, that's how they see you, you've done something, in my opinion. That's what I've always wanted somebody to be able to say, is hey, when you call Dorn, he's going to come in and he's going to bring a good spirit to the session, and he's going to, he's going to make the session better by being there. That's what I wanted to do. That's always what I've wanted to do. And so that makes me proud.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah.
So when you get to that point where you're in this position where work is happening steady, that sort of thing, I think time management becomes a really challenging thing, because we're working on sessions every day, and then we got stuff that we're doing on overdubs, and then you got another studio that you're running and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
What advice would you give for people as they're building their career, or maybe as they're moving into that next milestone of their career, on how to maintain their schedule and deal with time and deal with keeping in touch with people and that sort of thing?
Man,
what have you learned?
Boy, I've learned that it's hard. Man, I struggle with it daily, to be completely honest with you. And nobody tells you that that's such a big part of the gig. It's hard. That's the hardest part of it. One if not the hardest. The busier you get as a player and the more in demand you get, the harder it is to be able to say yes to everything. You know, coming up, I said yes to everything. I did not say no. Because I wanted, anything was an opportunity, and I saw it that way. Anything was an opportunity. So I didn't necessarily time management skill myself all that well even in the beginning. I just said yes, you know, and I was like, I figured it out. But I do think that it's important to, one, have a healthy relationship with the people, like leave time for people. Like I'm lucky enough to be married and have 2 kiddos. It's really important for me to save time for them. I don't work weekends anymore because that's time that's for them. And they don't get dad time as much as I wish that they did. But they also know that I work extremely hard for them. And so I think that save time for those relationships, whether it's your family, whether it's your friends, make time for that. But then also, when you have the time to work, be efficient with it. One thing that I've learned is that when I go to work, I actually put a timer on to help me be focused, because it's really easy to get lost in something and say, oh, I want to try this or I want to try that. No, hyper-focus in on what your actual task is and do it within the time frame. When I'm doing overdubs, you know, unless I'm using it as just a way to learn some new sounds that day, which can be fine, I put a timer. I put an hour timer, and I'm like, I have to get done with this song in an hour. That's my limit. So that I'm really focused and I'm working hard. When I'm the leader on a session, I'm watching the clock to make sure that everybody's getting their parts done within a timely manner so that we get all the songs done on the session. We got 3 hours and we have 5 songs. That means that you get 35, 40 minutes a song. And I have to make sure that everybody's done with their part and it's done right and the charts are ready to go, and that I'm rounding up everybody to go listen to the next song in the control room. Like, let's go. Got to get, you know, it's like all of these little time management skills are so important. And as you're coming up, make time to practice and make time to listen to music. Like, those are 2 things that sometimes, including myself saying this, have slipped, because you start getting busy doing other things. You forget that those are actually the tools that you need to continue to evolve and be better.
Right.
Don't let those slip out of your daily routine, you know. I make time when I'm driving to listen to new music. I'll always keep a running list. I always ask people, hey, what are you listening to? What's something that you've been loving? And I make a list. I have a list on my phone. And then I'll go in, set a playlist, and listen to it on the way in. You know, more today I have to end up checking mixes on the way in or listening to stuff. But I still try to make time on my drive to listen to something new. And a lot of times it inspires me when I'm going in to play a session. I hear something, I'm like, man, that was a cool sound. I kind of want to see what that inspires me to do today. Let me see if I can figure out a way to bring that into something, you know, or make my version of it, you know. It's like those things help get you excited about your day.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, it's not just about managing time in general with what you have to do, but also making sure that you make time for those other things.
Absolutely.
You know, that are super important.
Yeah, I think it's important, because you will get to a point where, you know, people will use every bit of time that you give them, you know, and you have to be very careful with that, you know, and you have to be careful with it, not only for your relationships, but also for your own sanity. You know, we all hit burnout mode, you know, and you're not the best version of yourself when you hit burnout mode, and you're not bringing the best quality to the session if you've been working 15, 16 hours a day, which is not unheard of. I mean, there's a lot of days, a lot of weeks that I work 14 hours a day, every day, except for weekends. I don't do weekends. But yeah, I mean, and you're tired. Your ears are fried. You've heard so much music that the only thing you want to hear is just dead silence, you know? Yeah, you know, it's like, so you have to also recognize that and take some time. You say, you know what? I might have gotten asked for this session, but I might not be the best version of myself to play it today. Maybe I need to go to a park and go walk, or go to the woods and hike, or do something that's your escape for that day, so that you come in fresh the next week and and you're going to be a better version.
Definitely.
You know?
Yeah. Got to be willing to do the work, put the hours in, but you also have to maintain that balance. And
absolutely.
I agree. I experienced the same thing early on, where just like, you're working, working way too much. It's good to cut your teeth. And,
it is. Yeah.
And get it rolling, but definitely important to maintain that balance.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the reason that we're sitting here today is because there's this platform that's being launched, and we want to be able to give aspiring musicians the information and experience and knowledge for them to be able to be successful in their career and do what they love.
That's right.
Why do you want to be a part of doing that?
Well, I feel like if I can share my experience and that helps another player, just even one player come up and do something, then that is worth it, period. Like, I want to see young musicians coming into the scene and thriving and doing well. And I also just have such a love for the session community and all of my brothers, because they are like brothers to me, all my session musicians. Like, we need that camaraderie and we need those young people coming in. We need to keep this session scene alive and thriving, in my opinion. Not just in Nashville, but also in other cities. I mean, I think that in other places, maybe it's not as much of a thriving community as it is here, but I hope that it gets to be that, because there's nothing like that camaraderie of session players together. And I hope that we can, help somebody that really wants to do it have a better advantage coming in to it and knowing a lot more than I knew getting into it. Leave the information behind,
Absolutely.
That's something we can do with our time.
Right.
So,
yeah. Pay it forward. And let's
that's
make
exactly
this
right.
Next generation
Make the
of musicians great.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Cool, man. Well, thanks a lot, brother.
Thank you, brother. Yeah.